Hi, good evening. I'm Michelle Stirling for Friends of Science Society, and I'll be your host for this evening's Friends of Science Society's 19th Annual Climate Science event. Tonight, we're pleased to go around the world and end up in Australia. We're going to be hosting Joanne Nova with her presentation, How to Destroy a Perfectly Good Electricity Grid in 1 Million Expensive Steps. Now, this is all part of our themed event, which is Net Zero plus Green Grid equals the Great Regret. And tonight we're going to find out how regrettable it is, as Australia is the crash test dummy of renewables. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Ken Gregory and W. Brett Wilson, for their generous support. By supporting us financially, we're able to bring you these kinds of events free, so that you can enjoy them and you can inform yourself about the things you'll never hear in the mainstream media. Before we get into our show, I'd like to talk a little bit about Friends of Science Society. We're a volunteer-run, nonprofit society. We're not a charity. We don't get government funding. We're not funded by industry. We don't represent industry, though we do talk about practical solutions for keeping a modern society going, which does include conventional fossil fuels. And we'll learn more about that tonight. We'll learn how important they are. But Friends of Science Society is supported by our memberships and our donations, and you can become a member. We invite you to become a member, or you can donate. We're trying to raise $200,000 because we're going into our 20th year of operation. And that sounds like a lot of money, but when you think we have 43,000 subscribers on YouTube, we've never monetized our YouTube channel because, of course, they would take us down. Actually, they wouldn't allow it to go on. So, 43,000 YouTube subscribers. One of our people said in the chat one day, well, if everyone just gave $12, then we'd be sitting pretty, wouldn't we? So that would be just like $1 a month. But in light of our 20th anniversary, $20, $200, $200,000, we'll take that. But any kind of support you can offer would be great. And you could just send an e-transfer to contact@friendsofscience.org. That's contact@friendsofscience.org. Or, of course, you can become a member, and then you get all the benefits of our membership newsletters, our reports, and most of our reports are online ultimately, but you'll get them hot off the press. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about Friends of Science event with Joanne Nova. Now, Joanne is a very popular Australian blogger, speaker, and presenter, and we would have loved to have had her here in Calgary in person, but in light of certain circumstances of the day, that wasn't possible. But she's a very funny presenter, and she skewers the green movement right in their guts. So you're going to hear tonight about the tragedy of the things that are going on in Australia with renewables on the grid. And so she will walk us through the steps to destroy a perfectly good electricity grid. And this is a very timely presentation because in Canada right now, we've just had the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, or the Canadian Climate Institute, they call themselves now, put out a report called The Big Switch. And it's pretty much filled with a lot of unicorns. So we're going to hear about those unicorns down south tonight. And without further ado, let me call for the presentation of Joanne Nova's How to Destroy a Perfectly Good Electricity Grid in 1 Million Expensive Steps. Oh, by the way, we'll have live Q&A after. So if you'd like to participate when you're in the live chat, just write question as your first word, and then write what your question is, and we'll extract those, and our team will send them to me, and I can ask Joanne when we get to the live Q&A. So let's roll tape, and let's see what Joanne has to say. The crash test dummy of renewables. That's Australia. Don't let it be Canada.
Ladies and gentlemen, how to destroy a perfectly good grid in 1 million easy steps. It'll cost a lot of money, but we're up to the task. Ladies and gentlemen, you might be wondering why you want to destroy a perfectly good grid. A fair question. And that the answer is the joy of blackouts. Blackouts are vastly underrated. Often they can be fun, and we might find out how much fun 9 months later. It brings people back to an experience close to nature, reminding us of how much we don't like being cold or hot or warm or drinking warm beer. It is therapy for screen-addicted kids, and of course great for observing stars, especially with all our wood-fired telescopes. And of course the best benefit of a blackout is it's the only 100% effective antidote to the CBC. It's the only time it's politically unbiased. I'm speaking to you here from Australia because it's harder for us to destroy our grid than anywhere else in the world. So if we can do it, you can too. What's the definition of the greatest global pushover in the world? How about a nation that is often the world's top exporter of coal, has the 5th biggest in gas, with the biggest distances, the lowest population density, the fastest population growth, and in a land where electricity prices have already doubled and which has already cut emissions a staggering 46% per capita since 1990, and yet we call ourselves a global pariah. It's in the news, on the ABC, it must be true. To double our patsy points, we're an agricultural nation. We're spending billions of dollars to reduce an aerial fertilizer that feeds crops and increases yields and helps crops to become more drought resistant. Droughts aren't getting worse, by the way. The worst one was probably 100 years ago and may have been 1,000 years ago. And the worst fires we've had here were 4,000 years ago. We reached 50 degrees Celsius across 4 states of Australia in the 1800s before anybody owned a car. And our rainfall trend is up and our sea levels are down by 2 meters compared to what they used to be 7,000 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to talk about glorious coal, which for some reason the Greens seem to want to protect underground while they burn forests above ground in power plants. Go figure. Now, the global crash test dummies of renewable energy have the 4th largest reserves of coal in the world. We have so much coal that we could keep digging it up for the next 294 years at the same rate that we currently are, assuming that we don't discover more, which we will. If we didn't export 3/4 of our coal but used it all ourselves, we could power Australia for the next 1,000 years. So there's a graph. Coal makes up in Australia 3% of our entire GDP. It employs 50,000 people, is one of our top 2 exports, and brings in about $50 billion a year. We'll never run out of coal though, because sooner or later everyone's go nuclear. And at some point, someone will figure out fusion and get that to work. And at that point, everyone will leave the coal in the ground. And as if that didn't make it hard enough, we also have a lot of uranium. In fact, we have more uranium than pretty much anywhere. Such is our burden in terms of, making energy expensive. Sorry, that slide is stuck at the top of the graph. I'll just bring that down so you can see it. Yes, you get my point. And when it comes to thorium, Australia must be God's gift to cheap energy because we also have the largest thorium reserves in the world. Not that most Australians could even spell thorium, and I don't mean that in a bad way, and it's not said with any disrespect. We just have so many resources. This is not even on the chart. Most Australians don't know it exists, they don't know what it's for, or that it's cheap and abundant, or harder to weaponize than uranium. A thorium reactor is intrinsically safer than a uranium-based one and doesn't produce much long-lived nasty waste. And thorium is 3 to 4 times more abundant than uranium, and yes, you guessed it, we seem to have the most too. Maybe we're just the best explorers and we're good at mining and we simply found ours, and there are other huge unknown stores of thorium around the world. Now, I can hear you skeptics out there saying, is Australia really succeeding? Do we deserve the hallowed title of the crash test dummy of the world? Well, to show you how we're succeeding, look at electricity prices in Australia. We've turned around a trend that lasted for 50 years. Real electricity prices fell for decades, even through the 1970s as inflation climbed, and the engineers were working on the system the whole time, improving those giant turbines, our networks, making them more efficient, and making sure that we could get great electricity. Citizens also spent 2 generations paying down the enormous infrastructure that helped to bring down costs. Now, if we look at what's happened in the last 20 years, we've turned that right around. It started with joining everything together in the national grid. Around about 1999, we put all the states, nearly all the states together, which made all kinds of things possible. You really can't wreck states one state at a time. You need to have them joined. And then you'll see in about 2005, 2007, we started to bring in unreliable electricity. And that's the green part of the graph. And as that goes up, you can see the prices do too. Could be a coincidence. Today, all the hard-won, masterful gains in efficiency of the 50s, 60s, and 70s have effectively been reversed in full. And you can look back in 1995 at how Australia compared with other countries around the world. We were doing a great job then with electricity effectively being sold at 4 cents US per kilowatt hour, which comparatively was fantastic, as you'd expect of a nation with so many resources. But look at what we've done in the last 20 years to our wholesale electricity prices. Now, notice as we look through, just there at the beginning of the graph, we've got electricity prices running at about $30 per megawatt hour, which translates to 3 cents per kilowatt hour, if you want to think in kilowatt hours. So that's the wholesale price of electricity. In 2007, there was a nasty drought. It caused prices to rise. In 2012, we elected a government which said there'd be no carbon tax, but there was a carbon tax, and that carbon tax, you can see, pushed prices up as it was meant to do. It was effective, and it started a big run in unreliable electricity being added to the grid because it was being subsidized through this carbon tax. And prices jumped. Well, we then voted to get rid of the carbon tax, and we actually did get rid of it, and prices briefly came back to where they should have been. But then we started closing coal-fired plants, of just a few. It only took a few, and prices really took off, especially after Hazelwood coal plant was closed in 2017, and prices jumped something like 85%. Now, lastly, you can see that dip in prices recently. Now, to bring those prices down, the only thing that would bring them down was a global pandemic. So we had one of those too. And here is, grid prices might be falling apart in Australia, but it does fix something. Here's our GDP from manufacturing. It was rising and rising. Luckily, we stopped that. We don't have to worry about growth in manufacturing anymore. To wreck a grid, we really need to understand it. Now, to begin with, I just want to point out that Canada and Australia are very similar in size. Our dollars are very similar values, so that everything I say next will hopefully be easy to follow. The Australian grid stretches for about 40,000 kilometres. It connects up about 21 or 22 million people, most Australians living on the east coast. It doesn't include the west or the north, which are full of little microgrids and smaller units. All the way up and down the eastern states of Australia, that electricity grid is running on the same frequency, on 50 hertz. In Canada and the US, it'll be 60 hertz, which means 60 cycles per second. And I want to really impress upon you how important that frequency is. You think about it, it is AC electricity we're talking about, which is alternating current. That's a push-pull kind of electricity, not like water flowing down a pipe, but like things going back and forward or up and down. Now, if you get two frequencies which are almost the same but not quite, it can be catastrophic. And to show you how important that is, imagine we start with 50 hertz and then we feed in, say I'm having a bad day, and I hook in a generator in the next suburb which is running at 50.4. So it's not much different. But look at what happens when those two frequencies meet. Here's a diagram showing what we get from the net effect of those two feeding together. And when you've got little lumps and bumps, but they're slightly out of time really quickly, you end up with one pushing while the other's pulling, and you get zero. So within 1.5 seconds, this is how fast it happens, you've gone from full voltage to zero. So, it's a disaster on the grid, and engineers break into cold sweat if the 50 hertz frequency falls by more than 0.15. So in other words, anything outside of 49.85 and 50.15 is just an emergency on the line. So here's a coal turbine in China, an ultra supercritical advanced modern piece of civilization. This is a coal turbine which will have a turbine in it weighing between 200 and 600 tons of steel, and it's spinning. And the important thing about 50 hertz or 60 hertz is that these things are spinning at exactly the right time to create that cycle, which means these up to 600 ton pieces of metal are spinning incredibly fast at something like 3,000 revolutions per minute. So it's turning completely over 3,000 times every minute. And in Canada and the US, it's even faster to get 60 hertz, and it's 3,600 cycles per second. Now, you just think about that. The weight, 600 tons, is equivalent to 300 cars just squished in there, or 2 767 jet airliners, all that metal, and it's revolving so quickly. Now, it takes a long time to get those up to speed and a long time to slow them down. So these are things that run really well when you run them at almost full speed, just continuously. You don't want to mess with these babies. They are the definition of inertia, spinning inertia, as it's called. So these are like running your car in the country. Once you set them up and they run, you get great fuel economy if you just go flat tack. What you don't want is to have other things interfering with them and shift them to city driving. You know, the solar, the wind that comes, that goes, these things are speeding up, slowing down. So you lose all that efficiency when you shift to city driving. Just quickly, I want to show you an average day on the Australian grid. So this is the energy we use. It's about 70% fossil fueled on this day between coal and gas. You can see the first peak there, the breakfast peak, is about 7 a.m. when everyone switches on their toasters. And then there's another peak at about 6 p.m., the highest energy use of the day. This is when we would really like the extra capacity, random electricity to turn up if we could. And as you can see, solar power is there when we don't need it at noon. Now, on the same day of that last graph, here's another graph. This one is of the money being spent in Queensland on electricity. Now, this was the day we had a spike at dinner time. When all the sun disappeared from the system, the solar energy went away. What we ended up with was spike price of $14,000, actually $15,000 per megawatt hour. And this spike lasted for a whole hour. During that hour, around about $100 million worth of energy was burned in just one state in 1 hour. Now, these price spikes and the volatility are becoming more common as we get big ramp-ups. All the solar goes away for the day, and yet our maximum demand kicks in the following hour, and it's difficult to manage. So let's look at what was happening on the grid in Queensland that day when we had a $100 million price spike last week. And you can see when we take the fossil fuels out of the system that the solar power disappeared just before the red arrow where the spike occurred, and so did the wind power. And this is one of those unfortunate things about unreliable energy. Now, right now, believe it or not, they're blaming this price spike on coal because we have a few old coal turbines which have dropped out of the system. But I ask you, go figure, would this price spike be solved with more coal power or with more wind and solar? And look at the headlines last week. There it is. Wholesale power prices soared 141% year on year, and households should brace for more. And then the caption of the steaming coal-fired plant, which of course isn't steam but condensation, the caption said outages at a number of coal plants helped drive up East Coast power prices. Get it? Get it? It's coal's fault. If coal is there, it's its fault. And even when coal's not there, well, that's its fault too. Now, the first step, and the most important step, is to repurpose your giant infrastructure and network, the one you spent 2 generations paying off. Instead of being a industrial electrical generation plant, right, and that's what you might think this looks like, you need to redesign it and decide that it is now a global climate controller. That's right, it's like witchcraft. This particular one, your lawn, is not just warming the planetary atmosphere, it's raising sea levels, it's making cyclones speed up and making fish reckless, including plagues of jellyfish. And just briefly, to put into perspective Australia's role in being a global climate controller, this is all the plants, according to Coal Tracker, that are in Australia. And this is how many are in North America. And note the boxes have bigger numbers. That's a number of turbines in each spot. And these are the ones in China. And some of them have numbers like 46, 100. It's like, yes, we are kidding ourselves. So what we need in Australia is much better weather controlling infrastructure, which is why we have added something like 14 gigawatts of solar panels and 8.6 gigawatts of wind turbines in the hope that we get better beach weather. Step 2 is to centralise control. To wreck a grid properly, we really need to have it all coordinated by one person. It's not possible to wreck things properly when you have to do it state by state. And this section here could be called Great Accidents in Bureaucracy or Case Studies in Big Government Failure. And this is not to forget that way back in ancient times, we actually managed each state separately. South Australia didn't join the grid till 1990 and Tasmania didn't join it till 2005. But then things were set to really muck things up. One of the things we need when we join up states together is interconnectors like these. And the interconnectors cost so much in Australia because the distances are so big, being about 5,000 kilometres from top to bottom, that the interconnectors can cost as much as an entire new coal plant these days. But never mind, they don't generate anything. Which brings me to Tasmania, a brilliant example in grid wrecking thanks to centralised government control. Now, there was a time when the Bass Strait Interconnector was delivering energy from the hydro dams of Tasmania up to the mainland. And thanks to carbon credits, these were worth a lot of money. So Tasmania was running its dams down in order to earn back the carbon credits. Now, they built a brand new gas station in only 2009. It cost $230 million. But if you have a look at this graph of water levels in Tasmania, the light blue area is where the carbon credit operated, and you can see they ran their dams down, it's just sheer greed, in order to earn money on carbon credits powering up the mainland through that cable. Now that was all well and good, except some bright spark decided around where that arrow is that they really didn't even need their one last gas fossil fuel plant in Tasmania. Remember the one they built in 2009? So they decided to mothball it. Only problem was that was the second El Nino year in a row, which for Australians means not much rain, and the dams didn't recover their levels in winter. So by December it was a disaster. When the Bass cable broke, suddenly Tasmania, which is an island, was islanded. It's electrical term for mean cut off from the mainland. And that meant they were fully renewable, but without much water left in their dam because they'd burned through it all. So they were really in trouble. And at that point in January 2016, they suddenly had to fly over all these diesel generators, squads of diesel generators from South Australia, so that they could keep their grid from blacking out. Now, a funny thing happened. See the star on the graph? At that star point, that was when the floods and the rains came through in a huge storm front that hit Sydney and travelled down through Victoria to Tasmania. So they had a lot of warning and they knew what was coming. Good news, you'd think they would be really happy. All this water was going to come fill their dams. But greed has no end. And they decided, despite the flood warnings, despite the seas, that they would fly planes into the air and cloud seed just to get that bit extra water. And so in the face of a coming storm front, they did some cloud seeding to add water to the dams. Tasmania may be the first place in the world to use jet fuel and silver iodide in order to generate electricity. Carbon credits make people do funny things. Step 3 is where we need the Ministry of Truth to turn up to the party. To destroy a grid, you really need to convince the masses that the unreliables are cheap and keep repeating the lie. We also need to keep saying CO2 is pollution and that the energy transition is the one we have to have. Here's Audrey Zibelman, the head of our AEMO, the managers of our grid market system, selling the deal as if it was a done deal. She said technology has changed and resisting this change is a little like trying to resist the internet. So hands up who remembers the 1990s and the early days of the internet and how the governments had to spend $13 billion a year just to convince us to get on and try it. And the antidote to all the stories of how cheap renewables are is to just ask which country on earth has cheap electricity and lots of unreliable renewable energy generators. And the answer is there isn't one. Look at this graph. And you can see that the countries with the most renewable power also have the most expensive electricity. Australia outdoing itself there, probably because we don't have much hydro, not compared to some of these other countries, and we don't have an interconnector with access to large nuclear plants like most of Europe does. So Ewan Mearns did a great graph where he actually took out the hydro and left us with just solar and wind, which is what we're really interested in. And then look at that graph line up. You can see there that all the countries on that line, you can almost predict exactly what their electricity price will increase to if they add more wind and solar. It's that predictable. And Australia provides excellent examples of just where the perfect conditions are for renewables to work and be cheap. If only they could be. On Flinders Island, it's run off diesel generators. It's not connected to the main grid. It's ideal for tidal energy, so we've been told. And it managed 60% renewables in 2018, sometimes for a few minutes, even 100%. It's in the roaring 40s, so it gets constant wind, gets a decent amount of sunlight every year, and yet even there they say when it's fully renewable, the prices won't be going down. And don't forget, they won't be taking away the diesel backup because there'll still be times when they need it to keep the lights on. One of the things you need to do to really wreck your grid is hide the costs. And one of those costs are the costs of things like blackouts in Australia, then broken cables across the Bass Strait end up costing about $500 million each. And the one in Tasmania, remember, could have been avoided if they'd only kept their one gas fossil-fired plant running, which they'd already paid for, and that $500 million was enough to pay for 2 brand new gas-fired power plants. The total cost of changing our grid, though, is much more than that. And Alan Moran did a study looking carefully into it a couple of years ago, commissioned by Senator Malcolm Roberts, and found that the actual price was about $1,300 per household. Now, imagine if people came and knocked at your door and said, hey, pay up now, we'd like to get your $1,300 for green energy. Do you think people might prefer to spend it getting a new bathroom, on books for their kids, on school, on healthcare? Who knows? But it's not like we're going to do a plebiscite and ask Australians whether they want to spend this money, is it? And of course, when people do knock on Australians' doors and ask them what they want to spend on renewable energy, the answer is 70% of Australians don't want to pay even $1 a week for renewables. And half of them said nothing at all. So when we look at studies overseas, there's similar numbers. 61% of Germans don't want to pay one more euro cent. 42% of US adults don't want to pay even $1 a month to stop climate change. So therein lies the problem. You have to disconnect the people from the electrical generation and the choice of how to spend their money. Speaking of money, there's really big money behind this, but most people don't know it. And how many people realise all the bankers of the world really want to save the planet? Run that one past your head. The giant Spanish bank once spent $100 billion changing Earth's weather, or trying to. And that's because they're nice people, right? The Bank of America spent $50 billion to save the world. Citigroup committed $100 billion. Goldman Sachs pledged $750 billion to change the weather. Banks are just falling all over themselves to help. Deutsche Bank built a 70-foot high clock tower of doom and produced their own climate science reports, and BlackRock wanted Australia to shut coal plants faster. They're just nice people, right? But maybe it has something to do with the fact that climate change is potentially a $7 trillion money-making venture for bankers. They all want carbon trading, because who's the brokers? They are, and they make money on every sale no matter who buys and who sells. Who voted for the bankers? Ask yourself. The real rulers of this world are the ones who decide the rules and the penalties. And let's take a closer look at bankers and their influence, because last year Australia adopted a net zero target. Now, Scott Morrison didn't have to do that. That's our Prime Minister. He was elected on the basis of less climate action, not more, and that's what Australians wanted. Instead, he voluntarily jumped up for this with the astonishing admission just before Glasgow. Here's a headline from November 12th last year. To explain why Australia had suddenly adopted net zero, he said, Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, said we would have faced an interest rate hike of up to 1.5%. So, this is like hands up Australia, it's net zero now, or a 1.5% interest rate hike. Who knew? So the bankers were bullying Australia into getting net zero, or at least that's the excuse we were told. Step 5 in destroying a grid is to use the most intermittent, unreliable and inefficient way, as well as the most expensive way to do it. Because of course, if you really wanted to change the weather and reduce CO2 emissions, you go nuclear. But let's look at wind power in Australia. We've got thousands of turbines spread across Australia, and people seem to think that if you had enough turbines, you would get reliable power, because of course it's always blowing somewhere, right? Wrong. Here's what happens with all of our wind turbines on the eastern states of Australia. Sometimes nothing. So that's from August 2015. We've installed a lot more wind turbines since then, but we still don't get a better result. When we look at the total production, here's March this year, and you can see there are lots of times when the bottom corners of those wriggly lines come awfully close to zero, and where 8.6 gigawatts of wind power produces next to nothing, like less than 500 megawatts. So how can we rely on a power system that just comes and goes? So random gigawatts has the illusion of looking useful, but it's the gift like a spare holiday house you don't know if you can use till the day before. It's the spare fridge in your garage that overheats in hot weather. It's the extra turkey for Thanksgiving that might not arrive till the day after you need it. The bills, the storage, the clutter, the chaos. There is the gift of the unreliable and unpredictable energy. And if we look at this, wonderful, look at this chart of wind production on the eastern states. This is like half the country producing wind power. It looks like it ought to be good, but the net number is that black line in the middle. And this astonishing graph, again, comes from anaro.id. Thanks to Andrew Miss Kelly. One person can do this kind of graph where a whole agency can't. You would think this chart would have been created by the AEMO or the AER or the ABC or the ANU or the CSIRO or the Minister of Energy. But instead, one man does it for free, and it's more useful than all the other agencies. So looking up close at wind energy, you can see that there are points when all of them just slow down and stop. Have a look at the weather patterns. These are the days when nothing happens. We get one giant high cell sitting across most of Australia, and the wind stops everywhere. So no matter how many wind turbines we build, we are always going to have the backup generation. And if you've got the backup generation, why use the wind? So here's our network in the last quarter last year from what was generated from wind, and everyone was getting excited. Well, everyone who loves renewables was getting excited that the number was getting so high at the top of the chart there. But look down at the very bottom, at the base of it, and the little green dark lines at the bottom. And that's the minimum guaranteed each month. So every month in Australia, we're getting down to almost nothing from our wind farms, no matter how many wind farms we install. Now, small generators are fragile. They don't have the spinning inertia of a giant coal plant. So wind and solar power just can't provide that kind of stability to a system, which we saw all too well in South Australia in September 2016. And to show you just how fragile these systems are, have a look. There's one interconnector between South Australia and Victoria. It made it possible for South Australia to feel secure despite relying on an immense amount of wind while a storm came in. Now, wind turbines have to cut out at high speed. They can't run when the wind's not running, and they can't run when the wind is going too strong. And they also had safety cutouts to cut them out when the frequency started to rock too much. And the frequency spiked, several wind farms cut off at once, and the frequency drop was so sharp that the interconnector between South Australia and Victoria sensed the pull, the increased load dragging energy away towards South Australia, and we were threatened with a cascading fault through the whole system. And at that point they had to load shed South Australia. They had effectively black out the entire state to save the rest of Australia, which is what they did. Now, as the state went into a black system, the people were left stuck in planes, stuck in lifts, stuck in trains, everything that needed electricity they couldn't run. They were even left on operating tables in hospital which hadn't quite checked its backup generators. Somehow, miraculously, no one was killed that day, although some frozen embryos were destroyed as they thawed out. It took hours, because it's a big deal when energy goes black. It took 4 or 5 hours to get electricity back started up again. You have to balance all the loads, supply and load have to match all the time as you reopen the system. But it took 2 full weeks to get the energy back up to where that red dot is at Olympic Dam. And Olympic Dam is so big, it's something like the 4th largest copper deposit in the world. It's the largest uranium reserve in the world. It uses 35 megalitres of subterranean water every day. So you can imagine the cost of having that sitting around doing nothing for 2 whole weeks while they waited to get the system back to it. I'm just quickly looking at how fast the energy system fell over. This is really instructive because it helps us to understand how fragile an electrical system can be when it doesn't have that kind of spinning inertia. If you look at this graph, it starts at 4:12 p.m. in the afternoon and finishes at 4:18. So there's only a few seconds across here and or a few minutes across this graph, and you can see how fast that line and that fall on the end is. Have a close look at that line and the fall there. This is a mere 6 seconds across the entire graph. And the break, it shows you how fast electrical systems work. The Hayward break is timed to the 10,000th of a second. Specifically, it occurred at 4:18, 15 and 84 10,000ths of a second. So the frequency was running at about 49.85, which was the danger zone, until the losses happened and those wind farms cut out. And at that point, it was all over, and all over very quickly. Now, step 6 is to cripple the free market, because it will work against you every step of the way. And in this case, you must never allow people to connect themselves directly up to a coal plant, or they might be able to provide themselves cheaply with electricity at much lower rates. But of course, we never let people get that choice. Here's what happens when it does connect up. Do you know that there is a Chinese cryptocurrency company which managed to do a deal to resurrect an old coal-fired plant which had stopped working, and they got it running again and got an offer of just 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, 20 kilometres down the road, the newsagents there, the Australian citizens, are paying 28 cents a kilowatt hour because they have to, because the government says they must. But this is the kind of price that can be done, and this is only a small, inefficient little coal generator, not one of the really big ones, but they still got this deal that tells you something about the real cost. And when we look at people who try and estimate the real costs of these events, we're looking at a study from the US, and we can see the long-term costs of running a coal plant. And in this case, along the bottom of the graph are the numbers of years, how old the plant is. And you can see the red on the graph, that's the capital cost. So it actually costs a lot to build these and to pay it off, and it takes about 30 years to pay it off. And the cost of electricity from these plants is highest for the first 30 years, of course, and falling. But once you get to a 30-year-old coal plant, you are sweet, sweet mama. It is all good news, because at that point, your costs on the side here are $30 a megawatt hour, or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So the best thing in the world for cheap electricity is an old coal plant that's already been paid off. And what do we do with our old coal-fired stations that are running really cheaply and are all paid off? We blow them up. And here's part of the reason why that has such a devastating effect on our electricity prices. Just one coal station, that was Hazelwood in Victoria, could change the whole market. We need to understand the way our market is set is through auction bids, a bid stack, and the winner of the bid stack at the top of the bids, that price is paid to everyone beneath as well. So a lot of people bid in negative numbers so that they just get included, and the highest bid that wins sets the market price for everyone. So have a look at the kind of bids. This is just last quarter. Last year, the kind of bid prices that are won. Here in this graph by the AEMO, you can see that brown coal is setting the price at $39 a megawatt hour, $7 a megawatt hour. These are averaged across whole quarters, $11 a megawatt hour. It's just extraordinarily cheap, still coming off brown coal. No wonder all the other providers on the grid want to get rid of it because it is just so cheap. On the left there, we've got black coal running at $40 to $60 a megawatt hour, gas anything from 71 to 150. So the prices that the different types of energy set make a big difference to the market. Now here's another way to put a bid stack forward, and you could see Bayswater and Liddell, the names of coal companies, when the bid prices and the demand is only 12,000 to 16,000, these coal plants are setting the price, and they're setting the price quite cheaply. The price is on the left-hand side there. As the demand grows, which is fair, as the demand grows, you'd expect the bid prices to be set higher, and when we need more energy, they are set higher. But just imagine we took out one of those grey ones, say Bayswater or Liddell. If you take the grey ones out of the picture, suddenly the whole bid stack slides to the left, and that means at lower demand, you're still paying higher prices. So that, of course, is something that's very important to the owners of Liddell Coal Generator. Now, Liddell Coal Power is owned by AGL, a very old energy company and the largest energy company in Australia, and it also owns lots of other generation assets. So spot the conflict of interest, because AGL has the power to shut Liddell coal mining down, which it says it wants to, coal plant down, which it says it wants to do. But this is a company that also controls at sometimes as much as 30% of the generation in our two largest states. So it can change the price that people pay by removing the cheapest assets out of the system. How screwed a free market is that? Yes, we are in deep trouble. And funny story about Liddell, and if we have a look closely at it, Liddell was given by the New South Wales government, as you do, to AGL in 2014 for $0. Literally packed up like a McHappy Meal and included with Bayswater Station, just tacked on the side there because, well, everyone knows coal's worthless and it's a stranded asset, so they gave it away. So the big advantage, of course, the gift to AGL was not necessarily the coal plant, it was the power to stop it and shut it down and make electricity more expensive. And of course, people have been clamouring now that they know it plans to shut it down to keep it running. But they shouldn't have given it away in the first place, should they? So it's another big government major failure. And AGL is only doing what it should, which is looking after its shareholders. And yes, predatory capitalism does spring to mind. So AGL is planning to shut this down over the next few years. It's already shut one of the 4 turbines, I think, there. And despite 3 offers from 3 different companies to buy it, AGL will not sell the thing they were given for free. In fact, one of the offers, I think, was $250 million. But as I said, they won't sell. This is an asset that's paid off by a generation, but it's worth more to the company shut than left open, which is something really sad about the state of the free market in Australia. And of course, we've all seen the stories in the newspaper about how coal is a dead asset, coal's on the way out, and lately in an election campaign in Australia, how the end of Australia's coal export boom to China is imminent. Of course, the free market, when it's allowed to run, has a different view on that. And we look at the price of coal overseas and just how stranded it is. Well, it's stranded at $355 a tonne at record high prices because, of course, the world needs coal. And in a real free market, it's not a stranded asset at all. And when we look at what China's doing, we see coal is important for energy security, according to people close to the top, and it's increasing the amount of coal it's burning. Far from being over, coal is still on the way up. And let's look at the effect that solar has on the grid. At least we know when it's coming, mostly at the middle of the day. Well, we don't always know when it's coming, but solar power is suspended by a river of money on the grid. And I'm going to introduce you to something called the duck curve, because this graph kind of looks like a duck. So this is the load curve, and each year more solar is added in the belly of the duck in the middle of the day. So the bottom of the graph there is lunchtime in the middle, and dinner time on the right hand side and breakfast on the left. So in the middle of the day, as more and more solar kicks in, we see the belly of the duck. The demand curve is dropping lower and lower and lower. And in this case, in Hawaii, it's bottomed out. You've actually got more solar than the system needs at lunchtime. And bear in mind, Hawaii has the most expensive electricity of all the states in America. It's telling us something there. But what's going on here with this graph is this massive shift in demand. What used to be provided by baseload, steady state, efficient producers, now they all have to sit out at lunchtime and do nothing and wait until the sun goes down, and then they get to run back in again. So the whole time, it used to be they would charge per hour. Now, most of their costs, the capital costs, the running costs, the staff costs, the insurance costs, most of their costs are not going down. Only they use less fuel. A coal plant doesn't have to run in the middle of the day. It can save a few million tons of fuel over the course of a year, but all the other costs, they go up. The maintenance goes up because you're stopping and starting these machines, you're adding load, you're reducing load. It doesn't work like it used to, just like driving a car in the country instead of driving it in the city. Of course, when it's in the country, it's really efficient. We all know that. You get better miles per gallon. So we're running our coal generators now like they're in the city. Stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. And we wonder why it's all getting more expensive. Ah, dear me. And as I said, solar, you can't always be sure it's there when you need it. Here's a cloud bank in Australia that just rolled right in, whoopsie, and it took out most of the solar panels, because of course the solar panels are on the rooftops, and most of the houses on the east coast of Australia are on the east coast of Australia. So we have this enormous bank of solar panels, and you'd think it would be shining somewhere, but not always. And in this case, this particular day, it took out 1,000 megawatts of generation just like that when the clouds rolled in. And so you can see that on this graph. On a normal day back then, they would produce 2 gigawatts, and that was reduced by a whole gigawatt. Imagine if a coal plant was there some days, but with no warning or a few hours warning, you lost a whole gigawatt of energy just like that. How do you run a system efficiently with that kind of change? Australians have been installing solar panels. Look at the rise in this graph. As more people installed solar panels, which are subsidised, the installation of the cost, it goes onto other people's bills. It got more and more expensive to have electricity, and pretty soon we're in a death spiral where everyone has to have solar panels on their roof in order to afford electricity, but everyone else who's left behind has to pay for it. Not surprisingly, there are more and more solar panels than ever, but look at what's happening to the other free markets. Well, we've had to change our free markets. We've now got negative prices thanks to the subsidies for solar and wind-powered energy. The subsidies in the market mean that these can afford to bid negative prices and still be making money, if that makes sense. But of course, negative prices means that the people generating the electricity are paying for it. It's not really a free market, is it? It's a crazy market. In other free market adventures, this is a new market which we had to set up. Once upon a time, when our grid ran on giant coal-fired turbines, we didn't have to talk about FCAS, which is Frequency Controlled Ancillary Services. But now we do, because once we stopped using coal all the time and started adding this intermittent renewable power in, the problem was we ran out of that frequency stability that comes with the giant spinning 600-ton turbines. So Because the other new intermittent turbines don't have that kind of frequency stability, we now make them pay for it. It took us a while to set this market up, but you can see in this graph that the quarterly costs of this new service called FCAS, which was, as I said, it was there for free years ago, but now we pay for it up to $100 million a quarter in one peak quarter. It's all just the fun of finding out how an electricity market works when you add unreliable, inefficient generators to it. Now I want to talk about more hidden costs, because that's where a lot of the costs are in the system. If we look at a great study done by Stacey and Taylor in 2015, they looked at how wind power can vandalize the other good things on the grid, like the gas turbines. And they looked at the cost of running a gas turbine with a wind farm at the same time and compared it to the cost of just running the gas turbine on its own. Because after all, wind power needs the gas backup, but gas doesn't need the wind. So when the two are paired together, it makes the wind energy reliable, but it adds nearly $30 a megawatt hour to the cost of the energy from the gas. Right now, that cost is added to the gas plant, making the gas plant look more expensive. But in a real free market, it should be paid for by the wind farm investors, not the gas plant. So we can see in the bottom part of the graph, we've got both units working at once to produce the exact same amount of energy that we got in the top from just the gas plant alone. But in the bottom one, we've got more infrastructure, we've got more costs, and when the wind is working and the gas plant's just sitting there, the guys are inside watching YouTubes, twiddling their thumbs, but they still need to be paid. So most of the costs of the whole system are driven up by pairing two units together to do the job that one could have done on its own. But we've tried managing this in all kinds of ways, from giant smelters to movie tickets. We even offered movie tickets to people at one point to leave their homes and save the electricity. We've also organised deals with people with their air conditioners in order that their air conditioners shut off at peak times, which of course in Australia are hot times. So you can do a deal where you save a little bit of money over the year, but the times when you really want it, when you've got all your friends there on the hottest day of the year, that's the time a centralised organised agency may just shut your air conditioner down for an hour or so, and they tell us you won't notice a difference to your comfort. Who needs electricity? And the last step in a program to destroy an economy is the oldie but a goodie. When you're doing something this stupid, it's really important you stop people from asking questions about it. And the main way to do that is just to call them a denier. It's bullying and intimidation, and it works until people get a hold of the trick and start fighting back. So ladies and gentlemen, with that note, I'll just say, please fight back for all of us. Our grid might become your grid, and our electricity bills might become your electricity bills. Don't let that happen.
Oh, hi, and welcome back to our live show. That was great. I just love the ending. Anyway, Joanne Nova is with us now, live from Australia, and we'd like to go to our live Q&A. And so we'll be able to do about half an hour or so of those questions and answers. And Joanne, welcome to our show, and thank you so much for a great presentation.
And thank you. Thanks for the chance to be here. I can't promise I can answer all the questions though, but yes, please, happy to help. And the chaos is increasing. Even today, I was just looking at our current prices, the instantaneous prices on the Australian grid at the moment, and they are extraordinary. We're right now, and it's the middle of the day. We shouldn't be having, we're not talking peak time at the moment. It's not the struggle hour. And yet the current prices on the national grid are in the order of $300. Let me just find the daily price. The average price is $300, $400, $1,000. I mean, well, that's the peak. $700 for an average price in South Australia yesterday. I mean, these are extraordinary prices that we're seeing on the grid. And this is supposed to be our easy time of year. We shouldn't be struggling in this time of year. It's why we do our maintenance in the soft shoulders in the autumn and the spring.
So I think we're looking at a grid which is really on edge. It's run out of spare safety margins for things, and little things are just pushing us over. One interconnector goes down, one coal plant blows a turbine, we get regular maintenance on an interconnector line, and the wind goes down that day. And then we're looking at on Thursday, they've just announced a lack of reserve. On the weekend they were warning an LOR3, a lack of reserve, grade 3, which is
Can you
extraordinary
explain
because
to us
that's warning of blackouts.
what does a lack of reserve in electrical system mean?
Okay. In order for supply to meet demand, and of course they have to meet very exactly even as they're shifting through the day, in order to make sure we have reserves, we always need a little bit of excess generation ready so that if something strange happens, someone can just push a button in the central command rooms. The men in there and the women in the command rooms must be so busy trying to match these flows now because everything's coming and going all at the same time. And so reserve means they've got to have a certain percentage excess ready to go. And a lack of reserve means they just don't have generation capacity. And a lack of reserve level 3 means we're looking at blackouts. Now, they cancelled that lack of reserve, and I'm not quite sure why, but for them to announce that in May, this was 4 days in advance, they announced it Sunday and then cancelled it some half a day later. But it shows just how close the whole system is running to really having problems.
Now, you have a big Tesla battery down there, don't you? Isn't that the problem solver for everything?
And part of the misinformation is always to call these generators and just to kind of ignore the fact that they never generate a thing. They just suck electricity, and you get back, 7 or 80% of what you put in. And then every now and again they catch on fire, and then you'll have to stand around for 4 days while you wait for it to finish burning because no one can put them out. Yes, we are adding batteries to the grid. It's another one of the hidden costs. And I've just been listing here while I, was listening to the presentation, listing all the hidden costs. And there's just so many of them. And so one of the things we've done is add synchronous condensers because we took out all of those coal turbines, the ones that weigh 600 tonnes or so forth, and they're spinning, which keeps that stability and the spinning inertia. We've actually just paid, I think, $200 million to add 4 synchronous condensers to South Australia. Now, South Australia is a tiny part of our grid. It's only something like 6% of our total eastern states grid, but they've added and these weigh 170 tonnes. They're just giant spinning machines. Obviously, we have to use electricity. They're not generators. They're using electricity to get them spinning like a flywheel, to tide you over the lumps and bumps in the frequencies that come with having a renewable grid. And when I say we're a renewable grid, remember we're still 60-70% powered by fossil fuels and by coal. And I noticed when the presentation I said something about when coal is running. Well, coal is always running in Australia, always. Mostly our energy is coming from coal all of the time. It's just a question of, in the second half of our production, how much that is still coal and how much of that is now renewables.
Yes, I thought that was quite interesting that one day that there was coal 65% and natural gas only 6%, because natural gas combined cycle generators are much more responsive than coal generators, but also they still get that very high peaking price when they have to suddenly ramp up. And the graph you had of Hawaii was really astounding.
Well, for the solar, yes, and the fact that it's such a big part of the grid. Here in Australia, solar is now starting it's very much the theme at the moment, is people have put so many solar panels on that we are starting to struggle with minimum demand, which used to happen at 3 a.m. every day, where we would get the lowest requirements on the network. Now it's happening at lunchtime because of the solar panels coming in. Here in Western Australia, we're in a little kind of grid. Luckily, we're not connected to the big grid. our wholesale prices are still cheap over here. We don't want them to build the extension cord that goes over to South Australia from here, because then we'll have the kind of mayhem that's going on in the eastern states. Although we're working on getting there all by ourselves. We're a small kind of 2 to 4 gigawatt network on the west here, with a population of about 2.5 million people. And we have, at the moment, minimum demand in summer has come down as low as about 800 megawatts. So even though we've got 2 to 4 gigawatts of production, we end up only needing in the middle of summer, less than a gigawatt of energy, because solar's using the rest. Now that all sounds like a success for solar, but of course the problem then is the ramping prices, and the fact that in the middle of the day, everything else on the network goes quiet. But then come 4 to 7 p.m., everything's got to come back online. Everything reliable has to come back online, or you hope that it's windy. And you hope. That's the way we run our grids now. Hope. Yes, looking at those prices, the batteries that we have to add are a cost of renewables. The snowy pump scheme that we're talking about, which is now exorbitantly $10 billion expensive, which is the idea of pumping the water back uphill. Do you do that in Canada, where you have to pump the water back up to fill your dams so you can run it downhill and get energy back?
There's only one pumped storage unit like that of any scale in Canada, which is at Niagara Falls. And it is fairly efficient, I think, because it is part of Niagara Falls. But there's an interesting note on the NEB CER website where they talk about pumped storage in the US being providing something like 23,000 gigawatts. I may not have that correct, but it takes 26,000 to run it, because there's a loss of power, and you have to do all this pumping. So it can be useful for the system, but it doesn't actually add extra generation. So we're building a small one here in Alberta. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I've seen estimates where we're losing, 20% of production on doing pumped hydro. And of course, we need pumped hydro here in Australia because our rainfall is so unreliable. Mm-hmm. And, perhaps not like the snow melt you get there. We, from year to year, we get incredible changes in rainfall depending on El Niños and La Niñas. At the moment, the dams have got water in them. But other years we run so low, as I mentioned, in 2007, they were even struggling to get enough water for the coal plants in Queensland at one point. I mean, that's extraordinary. So, but for us, evaporation rate's a monster. They're huge. And so I think we've got to push more water uphill to cope with that loss from evaporation as well. And so we're looking at 20, and I've seen estimates of up to 30% losses on our planned hydro scheme. But the entire cost of that hydro is purely a renewable charge. It's never put forward that way. But so we've got the extra cost from the synchronous condensers, the frequency control, the FCAS costs, which is a whole new market. We've had to change our auction systems for markets. They're still not doing very well. We've got to add interconnectors, and some of those interconnectors are $2 billion items purely to cope with renewables. Plus there's all the maintenance on all the things that goes up in price. And it's just extraordinary. Plus, we're losing productive farmland to solar panels, and productive farmland is really quite a rare thing in Australia. We have the oldest soils in the world in some places. We struggle with nutrient content, topsoil loss, and some of the best farmland happens to be next to where our large interconnectors are. So, of course, everybody wants to build the solar panels there because they want to be near those giant transmission lines. And unfortunately, that's the same land that we're producing food on. So it's this crazy kind of thing where Australia's got all those thousands, millions of square kilometres of space, only 7 million square kilometres here. But a lot of the empty space, which looks so attractive for wind and solar, is a long way from high tension lines. So they're finding you can't easily slap a big farm way out in the desert and then think that it's going to be economic to connect it up to the grid. And even a few projects that did then got hit with big charges. And losses as they're transmitting.
Yes, we have a connector from Calgary to the Pincher Creek wind farms. That's about 213 kilometers. It's a 500 kilovolt line, and it cost Albertans $2.2 billion. And the wind that we got at that time was only 4% of the power generation in Alberta. So, you know, you can build a whole natural gas plant like the Shepherd Energy Center here for $1.4 billion. So we're talking just about the big transmission line. So you're right, those costs in countries like ours, like Australia and Canada, where the distances are so huge, you know, they're astronomical, and the benefit is limited. And as you said, there's very little, there's quite a bit of line loss, and just overall very little benefit. And now we keep being told that wind and solar are free. I don't know if you've seen this article, but there was one in Recharge recently that wind and solar producers are on the verge of collapse themselves because of the supply chain issues, and the costs of of energy to produce wind and solar has gone up, as have the costs of things like neodymium. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, you mean in terms of the shortage of the rare minerals that are so concentrated in China and Russia and in places like the Congo, where we get 12-year-olds digging holes so that they can get enough lithium out. I mean, we've seen estimates here where people talk about there's not enough lithium in the whole world to build the batteries that we would need to back up the whole country. And people seem to have no idea how quickly battery power is burned through. And then we're talking minutes of supply for a state at best, with giant batteries worth a lot of money. Yes, the shortage of rare earth minerals seems to be something that very much suits China and Russia in terms of, you know, they're going to do very well out of it. And gee whiz, they would be wise spending money, encouraging people to be activists in our countries, to destroy our grid and to shift our reliability to those rare earth minerals, which they're digging up in China. And yeah, very much, you could see a strategic interest there that it's crazy that people can't seem to see here.
Yeah, so, it's very evident. We have a question here from Fillerator. Could Joanne go over again how bankers prosper? I kind of understand it, but would appreciate a bit more discussion.
And it is so important, that thing. The bankers want a new new market, a fiat currency in carbon. And it could be the largest commodity market in the world. I've seen estimates of it being a $7 trillion market. It would be bigger than gold, bigger than oil. It's just mind-boggling to think how large this market would be. Now, bear in mind, it's not a commodity. We're talking about paper credits for carbon, which is a lack of carbon in the air, lack of carbon dioxide in the air. So we're talking about an atmospheric nullity, a gap, and we're putting paper credits on that, and we're calling that a commodity market, which it isn't. And if it's $7 trillion a year, the banks would cream off all of the brokerage fees for the buying and the selling of these carbon credits. Now, it doesn't matter who buys and who sells. It doesn't matter what the price is of these carbon credits. The only thing that matters is that the government says you have to buy them, because then it's a forced market. You've got a whole customer base, a captive market. And the bankers profit very much from that. And it's an all or nothing thing. They make $0 if there is no carbon market. They make plenty of money if there is one. And so we have seen, I've been writing about this now since 2008, that the climate money, the biggest money, is often in profits for these bankers. And these banks have lobbied heavily. Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Barclays Bank, they were all HSBC. They were all lobbying enormously Goldman Sachs to get carbon markets in countries. Now, is it because these bankers really care about our environment, or is it because they really care about getting a forced market that they can make profits from? And then, of course, then there's the element of the globalists and the people who want one world government, because having a global financial system devoted to scoring carbon credits. That is just another part of that big aim of getting government control in a global sense, in a United Nations. It's a big source of power for them to manage international markets, to tell you what the price of airfares is going to be, because they'll be slapping an extra cost on that, and extra costs for transfers between countries. It's a great wealth shifter. And so it's a frightening amount of power added to people who are essentially unaccountable. And when did we ever vote for the people of the UN? When do we get to say and demand that the IPCC for climate requirements, when are they ever held accountable? We never get to say, no, wait a minute, that's not good enough for us, and we don't, we're just going to cancel our vote. And so it's another way of taking power away from the people and giving it to faceless bureaucrats in Geneva or somewhere else to decide things like our electricity price.
Mm-hmm. So I guess Canadians have to be a bit ashamed then that Mark Carney is leading this charge, and he's the big climate czar, and also used to work at Goldman Sachs, didn't he, for 13 years?
Isn't that a funny coincidence? Gosh, really?
Amazing.
Jobs for the boys, where they come and they go between the US Treasury and Goldman Sachs and back and forward and other places. Yeah, well,
yeah, it's a funny thing.
So,
we have a question
and when
here.
people say, where's inflation coming from? I say, just watch the St. Louis Federal Reserve and just watch the money supply grow. You know, that's what inflation always used to be. Just the increase in money meant prices went up. It's a supply and demand thing. Well, it's happening, and it's been going on for years. And that's where inflation is coming from. We've just been printing so much money digitally.
We have a question here from Ron. What is the political outlook in Australia when it comes to renewables? Who or what party will be pushing the policies, and do you see any hope for a good change in these policies?
At the moment, things are looking not very good at all. Our current Conservative government is likely to lose in 2 weeks' time to a fairly hidden kind of low target Labor Party, which has put very few policies forward, but we know they really want to do more greening, more this and more that. Now, the worst case scenario, which looks possible just 2 weeks from now, is that we will end up with a hung parliament with a Labor government in charge, and what we call the crossbenchers controlled by a group of independents who are not necessarily Greens. They're called teal independents, which means off green. But they're actually a bunch of people sponsored by someone who's heavily invested in renewable energy, who stands to make more money if they're elected and can control policies. And that'll be the excuse the Labor Party will use. Well, we have to get deals with the crossbenchers. And they're running in all seats, all Conservative seats. So they claim to be independent and neutral, but they are almost certainly left-wing Green candidates pretending to be centrists who are actually even further left than the Labor Party. They're demanding big policy changes. So things are not looking great at the moment. Our current Conservative government, it only barely won the last election by a couple of seats, but it did it on a policy of not pushing the climate agenda. And instead, they've gone net zero. You know, just extraordinary, as I mentioned in that thing last November before Glasgow, for them to say, well, we're going net zero now, even though the voters didn't necessarily want it, even though there's not really a push from voters. We're doing it because of the international bankers. It was astonishing. Now, that may not be the big controller. It was just what they said at the time. It may be that the deals with AUKUS, which I don't know if you've heard of, but that's the big arrangement for security with nuclear submarines between Britain and America and us. And of course, with the rise of China and the threat of military action coming from the north, which is such a very real thing for us in Australia, especially now with China talking about putting bases on the possibly Solomon Islands, which are very close to Australia. You know, we need that defence. We need to think about defence and getting nuclear submarines. Not that we've got nuclear power, as I mentioned, but hey, maybe we can plug those nuclear subs in our capital cities. We could stabilise our grid. We could have nuclear submarine powered grids. We laugh. We have to laugh. But it may be that, perhaps it was Boris, or perhaps it was Joe Biden, or whoever speaks for Joe Biden on behalf, pushing our government to say it'll do net zero. So maybe it was the bankers, or maybe it came with that security deal, but it certainly hasn't come from voters in Australia.
Well, we find that there's always a lot of unicorns in these proposals to go net zero, like the Big Switch report that I mentioned. Seems to think that it would be quite easy to connect all of Canada with the national grid, which, as you point out, is a terrible idea, if I'm not mistaken. Like, much better to remain regional, because then you don't have these cascading problems. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, what we found, say, with South Australia was that before it connected to the national grid, it had its own coal plants. So it had reliable kind of backup energy there, which ran the base load most of the hours of the day. They may use the gas for the peaking power in between when they needed it. But connecting to the coal plants in Victoria meant that it was possible for South Australia to go fully renewable and make the most of the carbon credits, just like, as I said, in Tasmania. It was possible for Tasmania to drain its dams, to sell them for carbon credits to the mainland, and put itself in a very vulnerable position. So those interconnectors give the power for the local state managers to do things they would never have done, to make decisions that just don't make sense in a stability way. And, you look at the current system this week in Australia, and I think they might have been doing maintenance on the interconnector between the two states on Thursday, and the forecast on Sunday was for no wind on Thursday in South Australia, which is just a disaster for South Australia, because then suddenly they don't have a connection to solid coal-fired backup. And without the wind, they were looking at the LOR3, which is the lack of reserve grade 3, which means rolling blackouts in the mid-season easy days. And it just shows how much our system is running close to the line. We can't afford any extra odd things, interruptions, or even normal maintenance, it seems.
In your earlier presentation that we trimmed a bit, you had talked a bit about the industry in Australia, especially the aluminum industry, and some of the challenges of having things like rolling blackouts or a system black. What happens to those factories, to those industries?
The large aluminium smelters that are still left in Australia use as much as 10% of their entire state grid. It's just extraordinary. Wow. One unit, one corporation using 10% of our largest state in terms of population in New South Wales, and 10% of that is going to Tomago, an aluminium smelter. So these smelters are enormous electricity users, and they have deals now. We have to make deals with them, because they are the quickest way, if we're caught short of electricity, to just save electricity and demand management, as it's called, which I call forced blackouts. And so these are on call, these big smelters, to just shut down if they have to. And you can shut them down, but 3 hours is your limits, because, of course, if the aluminium if it freezes, it gets cold enough that it freezes, then you've lost your whole pot line, millions of dollars to reinstate that. And so it's an expensive gamble we're playing. But we're doing it all over the place now. And the current news last night that I posted was that there are companies in the eastern states at the moment that are sitting there watching their spot contract prices and getting ready to shut down, because the last thing you want, for some reason, our prices are capped at $14,000 or $15,000 per megawatt hour as a price cap. The government set that rule. But when it hits those kind of caps, we're just talking $1 million bills coming through, and companies are sitting there with their fingers on the button, or probably auto alarms triggered in order to just shut things down. And it's a crazy way to try and run industry. And I read one intrepid greenie who'd done on his home wholesale spot prices. And just the chaos it ended up causing in his life, in order to avoid those, he would save money all year by having lower wholesale prices, but because he was exposed to those spot his life started to become consumed with watching for peaks and getting ready to shut everything down and making sure he wasn't running the oven or the air conditioner or the washing machine or the pool pump and things like that. And the chaos that it causes, we now, pool pumps are something which are, a problem in Australia. They are now installing special electricity circuits on some homes that don't let you run the pool pump for the 6 main hours of the day. I mean, complexity has a cost, and it isn't free to start adding in extra circuits and the brain space of, you now got to consider your electricity bills and will I go with this one or with that one? Is it worth the savings and the headache of not being able to run my pool pump for those 6 hours? Do I want the government reaching into my house, turning off my air conditioner, maybe only a couple of times a year? Is that worth $200? Or will that happen when my daughter's wedding is on and I've got everyone at home for the party afterwards or something, and I won't have air conditioning when I need it? And all these kind of questions we never had to ask.
We have a question here from Bill. Are you at all optimistic that the public might vote based on critical reasoning rather than an emotional basis, as for the past 2.5 decades, driven by catastrophically bad science?
I'm not very optimistic for the next election, partly because our state of national public debate is so low. I think people would vote very sensibly if our national debate, was a free speech debate where people put both opinions forward. I know when I sit in a cab, say, with a taxi driver, once I tell them I'm a skeptic, they almost all of them, I talk to plumbers, I talk to farmers, I talk to people who work with their hands, and they all get it. And they all know that this idea is like witchcraft, that we can control the global climate by putting solar panels on our roof. How many floods will we stop if we put more solar panels on our roof? It's a form of voodoo. And the average punter in the street is smart enough easily to get that it's a ridiculous thing to suggest we're going to slow down cyclones by putting up wind farms. It's kindergarten stuff. But no one really says that in the national debate. So I'm not all that hopeful that we will get there this election. And our big problem is the big parties. Both of them are so similar that, our big Conservative Party really isn't. It's nobbled itself. It is not able to point out the flaws of the Labor Party plan because it's doing a lot of them, but just less so. They're saying, well, we're going to correct the world temperatures too, but we're going to be more sensible than the Labor Party will about it. And we'll do it a bit slower than the Labor Party will, which means they've stopped themselves being able to throw in those great lines about, are we kidding ourselves that we're going to stop bushfires by putting solar panels on our house roofs? I mean, is that how you slow down a bushfire? And so we're not getting that political debate. I'm kind of hopeful, look, in a best case scenario in the next election, we might get some independents up from some of the small parties which are running in Australia. And I put a plea out to any Australians listening to study those small parties, to vote below the line, as it's called, and put numbers in the boxes, because we have preferential voting and people can vote for the smaller freedom-loving parties. And if we can get some of those on the crossbench or in the Senate, then that means the upper house might be able to limit the damage that the lower house can cause. And at least then we've got a situation in Australia where the lower house might be proposing the most ridiculous things, but the upper house should be able to slow that down. And I'm hopeful that the Conservatives in Australia, if they lose this election, will go back and start asking questions about why they've done so badly when the opposition is really so weak and has put forward so little policies, has said very little at all. So I'm hoping it'll be, a kick up the bum, so to speak, sorry to put it that way, but that the Conservatives need in Australia to get their act together.
We have a question here. Malcolm Roberts has been a great common sense voice in Australian politics. Are there many others that are making an impact on the climate change issues?
Craig Craig Kelly, bless him, was wonderful, was in the Liberal Party but ended up having to go independent over the vaccine issue, actually. He's really good. Matt Canavan is really good. There's quite a few guys, George Christensen, there are quite a few out there who do get it. Sadly, it just isn't the big numbers that we need. Most of our public debate is full of the usual lies. It's cheap, it's free energy, it's low cost, and everyone just keeps talking about the fuel cost of running a grid without talking about all the other costs. And we live under this myth that if you double the infrastructure, you'll get cheaper electricity. I mean, since when did having twice the generation capacity produce lower costs? It's just nuts. We've mirrored our system. We've effectively got a second system running, and we think somehow that having all those extra industrial plants is going to make it cheaper, when it means that half the time you've got industrial plants sitting there that could be useful that are doing nothing.
Yeah. We have a question here from Roger and Tom. What science is going into El Nino oscillation study by Australia? And of course, for our audience,
yes, we wish.
Could you just explain a bit about El Nino and La Nina?
Australia's climate is largely determined at the moment by the giant Pacific cycles, which are the ENSO cycle, the El Nino and La Nina cycles. So at the moment, you've got the dry conditions happening on the California and on the west coast of America. When it's an El Nino, we get those horrible dry conditions and lack of rainfall. And it's odd because you would think we're surrounded by ocean, we would have that stability of climate, but it doesn't work like that. What we end up is being very subject to those big ocean cycles. We can predict sort of 5 months in advance whether we've got an El Nino or La Nina developing, but even then, sometimes those predictions are wrong. So we really don't understand what drives those cycles, and because we don't understand them, we can't predict them. And that is ultimately what drives our droughts, our rainfalls, and the enormous changes we get across the middle of Australia. Some of it is not classed as desert, but that's only because 9 years out of 10 it gets hardly any rainfall at all. But 1 year out of 10 it gets a bump of rain, and that pushes the average just above the level of desert. But it's actually desert 9 years out of 10. So much of, and our bushfire risk is all about soil moisture and oil, because when you get a lot of rain across Australia making the soil wet, it limits our maximum temperatures. Because we've got that wetness in the soil, you get the humidity above the soil, the sun warming the soil takes more hours of the day to boil off the water, the maximum temperatures are lower, your bushfire risk is a lot lower. So everything about our fire risk is largely an El Nino, La Nina kind of risk. And we look at long-term records. We've got records going back to 1850 for rainfall here. There is no trend that turns up that connects with CO2. It isn't a factor, except in WA, where I live on the west coast, and nobody understands our rainfall, because our rainfall here is not connected to the El Ninos, which is a Pacific thing, but it is connected a bit to the Indian Ocean dipole, but it's also connected to the Southern Ocean. So we've got 3 different ocean cycles. We can't predict the rainfall patterns down here in the bottom corner of Western Australia, but we've become the poster child because for the last 30 years, rainfall has decreased here. But our rainfall in long-term patterns seems more connected with Antarctic cycles and snowfall in Lower Dome. So, it's a mystery. And hydrology and rainfall is so important in Australia. I wish we were studying it from a deeper perspective. Perhaps solar cycles, lunar cycles give us more clues.
I wanted to ask you something about the medical community. I don't know if it's happening in Australia, but in Canada, there are a group of doctors that are pushing for net zero. They go under the acronym of CAPE, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And there was an article published in the British Medical Journal calling for net zero by 2030, and that they felt that global medical supply chain and the whole health business could cut emissions in half by 2030. And that's supposed to be 5% of the world's emissions. Is anything going on like that there? Like even the Lancet has come out with a number of publications calling for more wind and solar. Like, don't medical people know that modern medicine only exists with reliable, affordable, secure supply of electricity?
Look, I would say the medical units, yes, there's similar kind of things going on here. It's to do with all of these subcommittees in science units and science-related professions. The subcommittees seem to be easily captured because the real engineers and geologists we know are very skeptical of climate change, and yet even some of their groups, professional groups, are pushing for ridiculous propositions to do with controlling the climate using our solar panels and whatnot. The medical units are doing it too, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not coming from doctors per se, although there are a lot of doctors who like the idea of climate change because that's part of the scientific fashion industry that it is. And when you pay enough money through, I mean, let's face it, big government is now the largest corporation effectively in every one of our nations. It's a quarter to a third of the economy. It's the largest employer, the largest provider of grants at universities. It's the largest this, the largest that. And that speaks, that money talks. And so all of these subcommittees, people jump on those committees who can then say voluble things. They get rewarded. They're looking at personal rewards later and just the fashion reward. A lot of this is about impressing people at dinner parties on Saturday night. You know, I'm going to go along on Saturday night and tell everyone I did this. And all my friends who are also doctors and doctors' wives living in rich suburbs with expensive salaries who don't care about the price of electricity because they got plenty of money to pay for it, they earn brownie points with all their friends. And so there's a social thing as well as a monetary thing going on. And until things get bad enough that the average doctor or the average engineer or the average geo actually pays attention and goes along to these committees and votes or stands on them or protests, it isn't going to change. So I guess, you know, the call I put out to everyone is we can do things, we can change things, but we have to pay attention and we have to start speaking up and saying something and not just putting up with it when these people pretend to speak on our behalf, because we can push back, and it is happening in some of those committees and institutions.
Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on. I want to thank you very much for your presentation, for all the work you put into it, and for all your time this evening with these live Q&A questions. And I hope that you've opened a lot of eyes in Canada and in other parts of the world. And we'd love to have you back sometime to do something on the carbon credit world and the bankers. That seems a very interesting angle. So I'd like to wish you good day, I guess, because you're down there. And thank you, Joanne Nova. And I hope people will go to Joanne Nova's blog and have a look and see what she's up to. She's got lots of global information on climate and energy all over the place on her blog. So thank you, Joanne.
And send your questions in comments on the blog if you think of something else you want me to say. And I guess I'd love people to just go away with the message of these giant infrastructures, the coal plants that we've paid off being the biggest assets on our system. And that when people quote tiny prices saying, oh, solar is, you know, producing $10 a megawatt hour prices at lunchtime, that what they're not saying is that solar and wind are pushing up the prices for the rest of the day outside of when they operate. They make everything else on the system more expensive. They are the vandals on a good grid, destroying the efficiency of everything else that you spent generations building.
Thank you. Sage advice. Okay, well, thank you very much. That was great to have Joanne with us. I wanted to mention that we have a number of excellent reports that were put together by our professional engineering team. We have a recent one on the clean electricity standard called Reality versus Delusion, the true cost of wind and solar for Alberta, and what you really need to know about renewables that the Pembina Institute won't tell you, and In the Dark on renewables. We have some videos on these topics, and we also have additional reports. There's actually even a simple blog post about the village of Carmangay and how much their little solar farm is costing us. It's an arm and a leg. So I hope that you'll have a look at that. So we're going to sign off here. I just wanted to say thank you again to our sponsors, Ken Gregory and W. Brett Wilson. Without your help, it would have been very difficult to put this event on, and with your help, we've been able to actually offer it to the public for free. And I'd also like to thank our event producer, Jay, and our program producer, Mike Visser of the Director's Chair. I'd like to thank our board of directors who've been very helpful through this, the volunteer board, so they don't earn a penny. And I'd also like to thank you, our audience and our loyal followers and supporters. And if you can help us out, we would like to raise $200,000 to go into our 20th year of operation with a full tank, as we like to say, a full tank of gas. So, you know, a small donation is very helpful, as well as a big donation. So you could just join us, become a member. You can go to our website and donate there or become a member, or you can just send an e-transfer to contact@friendsofscience.org. That's contact@friendsofscience.org. And actually, we'd mostly love you to join as a member, because then you'll get all of our materials and you'll be able to share them with your friends. But subscribe to our blog, look at our YouTube page. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Facebook, and we're very active on Twitter. So we'd love to have you participate. And if you can't afford to send a donation, just share our material. If you know a representative, a policymaker who you think is misinformed on these topics, please share our material with them. You can be an on-the-ground advocate, just as Joanne Nova said toward the end. So speak up, don't be silenced, and you have a right to dissent. And on that note, I'd like to wish you all a good evening here and a good day in Australia. And thank you very much for watching our show. Net zero plus green grid equals the great regret. Let's not go there. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Stirling.